So let's talk about which Votann units dwarf the other for in-game power and which ones come up short. Time for a tier list of Leagues of Votann units in 10th edition 40k. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Leagues of Votann, and in this video I thought we'd go through each unit in the index and talk about how strong they're performing in game at the moment. Generally, as I'm sure most Space Dwarf players will be well aware, they're having a bit of a tough time in 10th edition so far, around about a 32% win rate at grand tournaments and things, and arguably Warhammer 40k's most struggling faction right now. By most tournament ranking metrics, doing a bit worse than things like Death Guard or Abmech. Definitely not the best place to be in. Most units are a bit overcosted relative to their in-game strength. I feel like perhaps Games Workshop didn't really realise just how much their power balance would shift when they took away multiple layers of their special rules. On the plus side, at least, it should mean that they're first in line for good points boosts when the next balance pass comes out, so fingers crossed they won't be staying this way for long. In this video though, I thought we'd talk through which units are looking best or worst at the moment, the ones that are perhaps more likely to be run in competitive lists to good success, and which ones perhaps seem particularly underpowered in the faction overall. I feel like there definitely is some disparity despite the Leagues of Votann not really having an enormous unit list to try and get in line. I'd argue that things were perhaps less balanced than they were. As always with Warhammer 40k, tier lists are a little bit arbitrary, different people's playstyles will favour different things somewhat, and you could probably have ranked a few of these a little bit higher or a little bit lower depending on your army and context and what job you want the unit to do. This list is made through a combination of community polling, higher placed tournament lists, and my own opinions. I will go through them in order from lowest to highest, and do a rough appraisal of each strength, and why I'd rank each unit where I would. Jumping straight in then, and in tier 4 I've just ranked the one unit as Uthar the Destined, 115 points for the Leagues of Votann's only named character, the alternative build for the Carl. I think Uthar is kind of struggling to compete with the other characters at the moment, being by far the most expensive, and I'd say probably that adds less value than a Carl, particularly with enhancements, even if his stats are a little bit more beefy, having better defense and better damage. Like the cards, he hands out judgment tokens, which is handy. Then he has some AP -3 and damage 2 melee with devastating wounds, and his special rule now allows you to change one of his own personal wound rolls or hit rolls to a 6 each turn. So it does mean that if he's in combat, you can pretty much guarantee at least some mortal wounds on the foe, even if it's not loads. Otherwise, if he does get directly targeted, he's fairly tanky and is able to reduce enemy damage to a damage characteristic of 1. That is helpful, though usually if it's being directly shot, that's a pretty bad thing in the first place, as it means that his bodyguards are all dead. And I feel like in general, just compared with the Carl that gives the units lethal hits, costs less, and can take some nice enhancements, Uthar's going to struggle to get a look in most competitive lists. Realistically, he's not truly unplayable, but still probably something like a good 20 points overcosted compared with the other characters, I think. Moving up to tier 3, and here I've chosen to rank the Chthonian Berserks, the Hearthkin Warriors, and the Grimnir. Starting with the Berserks, these are the melee specialist Votann, 135 points, or 270 for 10 of them. As with quite a lot of melee units in Warhammer 40k, they've lost a lot of hitting power going from 9th edition to 10th, now no longer getting auto wounds, and not wounding a lot of vehicles on a 3+ anymore, usually on a 5+ or worse. And it means that while they can still bully infantry fairly well, they're not going to do so well against really hard targets. Otherwise, they've got a Mole Grenade that can slow units, and they can fight in death, which is handy against enemy melee units. But I feel like for how slow and hard they are to deliver, and the melee damage that they do, they're just not really tanky enough for the cost. Toughness 5, 2 wounds and feel no pain I don't think is really enough when their save is so bad. They also don't have the option of leader characters as well, which is a better incentive to some of the other units, particularly the Hearthguard. I think it's perhaps a bit unhelpful that the only dedicated melee unit is a bit underpowered at the moment. I feel like anything out of hitting harder, costing less, or being tougher would all help them. Next up, I feel like one of the main reasons why Leagues of Votann aren't doing quite so well at the moment is their standard Hearthkin Warriors just aren't really very attractive as a standard troops choice. These are the squad with easily the most options in the index, and the best options for character support, but they just seem to be overcosted for what they do, really. Their defense isn't terrible, but not spectacular either, at effectively 13 points per model or so, 1 wound, toughness 5, a 4+ save with a feel no pain. And for their damage output, they're fairly slow, reasonably short ranged, and their special weapons, while they aren't terrible, might just struggle to make them into a really focused unit that's good at killing any one target, really. They do have okay objective control, plus sticky objectives is helpful. I feel like they perhaps aren't awful for a squad camping a home field objective, or maybe splitting in half with a Sagittor, or if you just really want to make one of the HQs work and you need an extra bodyguard for them. I feel like they'd probably be a lot more attractive if you could take 20 of them to get a bit more mileage out of a buffing character, but I feel like these guys could come down by quite a considerable number of points if they aren't going to boost their rules somehow. I feel like a lot of lists do still wind up taking them just kind of out of necessity, but I have seen a fair few lists just completely not take them. Not excellent for an army that's got so few choices, and these guys are the ones with the most options. Finally, for tier 3 units, there's the Grimnir for 75 points, which I feel is kind of tied to the worth of the Hearthkin Warriors, really. He's 75 points and kind of just effectively gives you Hearthkin Warriors but more. He makes the unit a little bit tougher with toughness 6, gives them a once per game cancel battle shock, some fairly solid anti-infantry with his ranged attack, with an attack that's fairly good at killing Space Marines, and then also effectively a couple more bodies in the unit with a couple of corvs with the bolters. Between all that, you basically just have a unit that's a bit tougher and a bit more dangerous. Seems like he is kind of fairly good value for the points if that's what you want. Though again, I feel like if the Hearthkin Warriors were a bit cheaper and a bit more efficient, the Grimnir might be a bit more relevant and more commonly taken in competitive lists. Next up, and moving on to tier 2, I'd rate these as fairly solid usable Votann units at the moment, though perhaps not the absolute pinnacle of kin technology at the moment. First up for 120 points is the Sagittor, a light vehicle with scout and some reasonably heavy firepower, most useful to either transport a squad of Hearthkin Warriors or Chthonian Berserks up the board, and provide a bit of fire support while doing so. I feel like it's kind of interesting for splitting a Hearthkin squad, as that's one of the ways that you can get effectively one of the cheapest units in the index. You could have one unit with the special weapons go in the Sagittor and move up the board, and the other one with the more basic guys sit on the home field objective, and potentially hold it down for some pretty decent objective control for fairly cheap. I think all of its weapons are scary enough. Either the missile launchers or the high las beams are probably the best on the top weapon, depending on whether you want to hunt tanks or more sort of medium infantry. Though I'd say that its defense isn't particularly standout, and its special rule is kind of weak, as to advance you have to sacrifice its firepower, which isn't really what you want to do when it's got some good guns. Seems quite nice for trying to secure midfield objectives though, and a scout move might allow you to get somewhere at least relatively safe turn 1 if your opponent does get first turn, maybe hidden behind some sort of ruins in the midfield where they can't be targeted. Next up for 105 points, or 210 for 6 of them, are the Hernkin Pioneers. Again, some scout movers and some fairly fast moving bikes with some anti-infantry weapons. I'd say maybe not quite as utterly critical to the index compared with the previous codex in 9th edition, given that they've lost the old style judgment tokens that were really good on their high volume of fire. Plus, while they do have some objective control, it's not really quite what it used to be with objective secured. I'd say that they're okay and kind of good to support the advance, perhaps 1 or 2 units to help early game board control. Not really ones to rely on for mainline damage dealing though, with low AP and only mid strength at best. Next up for 75 points is the well-armoured Einherjar Champion. Einherjar Hearthguard are one of the best units in the index at the moment, so he's kind of relevant for them. He basically helps them hit a bit harder in combat. I think the Mass Hammer's probably the most interesting out of his 2 loadouts, giving him a lot more threat against big heavy enemy vehicles, which the others might be wounding on 5s. Even with just 3 attacks, I don't think he's too bad for just 75 points for that, and he gives the squad full reroll charges and some mortal wound impact hits as well. Could be quite a nice support for a deep striking squad maybe, or one coming in via rapid ingress and giving them a bit more reliability for making combat after they've shot something. I'd say it's a solid and usable upgrade for the squad, but maybe not quite in auto-include territory. In general, units of them do need a character to get that -1 to wound from their Oathbound Bodyguard rule, so that would mean either this guy or the Carl. I'd say probably the Carl's a little bit more important given the judgment tokens that he hands out, but this guy does seem absolutely fine and does see a fair amount of competitive play. He'd probably just be a second pick after you've got a Carl or 2 for me. Probably towards the top end of tier 2, could have been a tier 1 if I was feeling generous. Lastly, we've got the Brockier Ironmaster for 75 points. Again, a character that's broadly going to help out both the damage and the defense of the unit. I think overall he's probably better for the Thunderkin than the Hearthkin Warriors, as they're just a bit more scary damage dealers overall. I feel like for 75 points he brings at least a fair amount of utility. His main buff is that he gives the unit a +1 to hit, which helps out if you're not shooting against something that's got a judgment token on it. And he gets to repair injured models from the squad, helping out his exoframe buddies. I think adding in 4 ablative wound models into something like a Thunderkin squad is really quite nice. In an ideal world, you could have those little cog robots eating big shots that might have killed a Thunderkin each if he wasn't in the unit. His assistants do have a few other attacks as well, and he gets to chip in with his grav gun and grav hammer. Perhaps one of the biggest downsides is not really being able to fit in a Hecaton land fortress alongside the squads though. Overall, I'd say usable enough, perhaps best with something like a Thunderkin squad coming in from strategic reserve perhaps. Finally, we get to Tier 1 and the units that are perhaps the best that the leagues have to offer right now. And perhaps first and foremost amongst them are the Iron Here Hearthguard, 165 points for 5 of these Votann Exo Armored Terminators, or 330 for 10 of them. In general, they do seem to be considered basically the best Votann unit at the moment in terms of efficiency. Most competitive lists tend to run at least a fair number of these guys, and they were also voted best by you guys in the channel poll and by a fairly large margin as well. These guys are fairly nicely tanky for the points cost, just over 30 points per model for 2 wounds at toughness 6, a 2+ save, and built-in -1 to wound versus high strength attacks. Fairly survivable all round, and then I'd say at least somewhat even threat in terms of shooting and melee. At range they get their grenade launcher with a whole bunch of blast keywords, which is quite powerful against hordes, plus either a whole bunch more spam shots and some chance for mortal wounds with the Vulcanites, or some more heavy elite busting shots with the plasma guns. I feel like both of those are at least fairly usable. In combat for their 2 options, I think I generally prefer the Concussion Gauntlets at strength 9 and damage 2. I feel like they're probably the better choice over the Plasma Blades right now. And as well as being reasonably efficient on a per model basis, they can be quite a big squad that's quite efficient for things like stratagems and leaders in the first place. They do also have the option to either teleport or rapid ingress to the front line, something that seems at least a fairly decent way to deliver them given their slow movement. Overall, hard to go too far wrong with in a competitive Leagues of Votann list at the moment. I think there's at least a reasonable chance, though, that it might be a little bit less standout if the rest of the army does get some points adjustments at some point. Perhaps the other really big mainline damage dealer that's a competitive staple is the Hecaton Land Fortress, 245 points, and along with the Hearthguard, they're perhaps the other good primary damage dealer unit in the index. Land Raiders sort of levels of durability with 16 wounds and a 2+ save, and that's really quite nice when you can get them cover really quite easily in 10th edition by just nosing part of it behind a ruin or something. And then quite a lot of fairly scary firepower, a whole bunch of damage 2 shots with bolt cannons and the auto cannon, then a big primary weapon, where I'd probably be most tempted either by the railgun or the heavy SP conversion beamer. At a big 245 point shooting vehicle, it's quite nice for the Leagues of Votann shooting stratagems, potentially the sustained hits one or the return fire one depending on the loadout, and could be an interesting choice to deliver some closer range infantry up the board and jump them out onto objectives. It can allow some full wound rerolls against the target if you focus some of the Hecaton's guns on the same target as the squad getting out. That could be nice enough for a unit of 3 Thunderkin maybe, or some Hearthkin warriors potentially. In terms of numbers of these, I've seen quite a lot of competitive lists deciding to run 2 of them. Next up, we've got the Brockier Thunderkin, 95 points for 3 of these, or 190 for 6. These are the ranged fire support exoframe Votann with either the bolt cannons, grav guns, or the SP conversion beamers. Out of the 3, I perhaps most prefer the damage profile of the Graviton blast cannons, a whole bunch of strength 5, AP -2, and damage 2. That's both really quite nice against heavy infantry and fairly dangerous against vehicles as well. The only major downside to that one is the short range, so it could be either outranged or put them at risk of being charged, I suppose. Still seems easy enough to deliver out of strategic reserve or jumping out of a Hecaton land fortress. They do have a trick of being able to overwatch on a 5+ as well, which could be kind of meaningful depending on what moves near their range. I'd probably rate these guys as a little bit lower than the Hearthguard or the Land Fortress, as they're a bit harder to use perhaps, either lower tier 1 or top of tier 2. Finally, last but not least, we have the Carl himself, the man who makes the judgment happen. He can either join the Hearthguard or the Hearthcomb Warriors and gives his unit lethal hits, potentially a buff that could go a really long way on the Iron Here Hearthguard with being a big threatening unit. He hands out judgment tokens, so being in a fairly tanky unit is quite good for him there, and could be a good character for using that long list enhancement to basically mark an objective for extra judgment all around it. Really quite nice to keep the +1 to wound getting a little bit more likely. He also does chip in with some OK melee as well, and can grant a 5+ invulnerable save to a unit with his Rampart crest if he wants to, or be another option to allow the squad to deep strike. I feel like a lot of the Leagues of Votann units don't really get to good damage outputs unless you've got judgment tokens on the target, so I feel like he's perhaps one of the most necessary characters out of the entire index. He actually has a bit more impact on other units besides just the one that he's leading and his direct damage. Let me know your thoughts on the units from the Leagues of Votann Index though, which ones are working well for you at the moment in game, and which ones are most in need of either points or rules buffs when Games Workshop eventually gets round to it. If you enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, while I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support there. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, an absolutely massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.